Hi, I'm Mark Malkoff, the host of the Carson podcast about Johnny Carson, and you are watching Mr. Media.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Mark Malkoff is probably the most and best prepared podcast host in the world. If you've ever listened to his show, The Carson Podcast, you know what I'm talking about. Rarely will you hear Malkoff say, "I didn't know that," in reference to something his guest says. More likely, as comedian Bob Saget and others have done, Mark will be reminding them about something from their lives that they forgot or didn't think anyone knew about them. Now, with its singular focus on the career of the late Johnny Carson, host of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and Mark is always careful to say the show's full name, so I will be too, the Carson Podcast is the essence of a great podcast. In A Beach of Sand, Malkoff takes Carson-related grains and puts each one under a magnifying glass. He has landed some of the biggest names in show business, whether from in front of or behind the camera, from Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner, for example, to Barry Diller and Rick Ludwin. But he also goes deep into the lives and experience of people who worked on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and at Carson Productions. If I could only recommend one episode of the Carson Podcast from its now 5-year run, it would have to be his conversation with Kate Capshaw, star of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and wife of Steven Spielberg. She rarely consents to be interviewed about anything, but when she agreed to speak with Malkoff, she let it all hang out. Now, if you want to know more about Malkoff, who has worked on the staffs of The Colbert Report, The Late Show with David Letterman, and the original Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with Regis Philbin, among many others, check out his Wikipedia page. You won't be disappointed. To quote Mark, enjoy. Mark Malkoff, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start the way you usually end your show. Mark Malkoff, who was Johnny Carson and what did he mean to you?
Oh, wow, you're giving it back to me. I do that almost pretty much every week. I've done that to probably over 150 people. Johnny Carson, as Steve Martin said, was probably more famous than the president. For 30 years, he had no serious competition, which I still marvel at. He was a talk show host that people decades later, and he's been off the air for 26 years, they still look at Johnny as the man. And he was able to play to everyone. He was from Nebraska. He was able to play to the Midwest. He was able to play to the cities. And it's the likability thing. I don't think that there's anybody that was behind the desk that has been more likable. He could sit down with A-list movie stars. He could sit down with kids, scientists, authors, people that the show would label as civilians, these people that probably had never been out of their hometown or certainly not to Los Angeles, and make people feel equally comfortable. He was able to just shine when he was on camera. His staff basically said when he was on camera, it was like pulling a switch where he became this person. And his happiest times were normally on the show. And nobody has ever come close in terms of what he accomplished in late night. And I don't think anybody else ever will.
But where did you make this connection to him where you have devoted so much time and energy to a man who's been deceased for many years, who's not there? And the world has moved on. There have been 2 other Tonight Show hosts since he retired. You're a relatively young man, from what I can tell. Why Johnny Carson? Why not? I mean, you worked on the Letterman show. Why not do this for Letterman?
There was just so little information on Carson, which is it was I just couldn't understand why. And basically, if you want to know something about Bob Hope or other entertainers like Chaplin, there's just so much that's been written about them. And Carson's friends just were out of loyalty, and the staff rarely, if ever, talked about Carson. Certainly not at length. And my dad, when I was a kid, would let me stay up on Fridays sometimes and watch Carson. So I was watching the show from 5 or 6 years old. I certainly didn't get the politics and the monologue, but there was certainly enough in an episode of The Tonight Show where, especially if the animals were on or if Jonathan Winters was on, some of the stuff would be over my head as a kid, but there was just something likable about that show. And several people have mentioned it was like for a viewer, it was like being at a party, and it's the coolest party that you're looking at. And I had so many questions just as a kid. Who was holding the curtain open for Johnny? My dad said that they would arrange what they were going to talk about ahead of time, and I was thinking in my head, who has this job? Like, who are these people? What is going on with Fred DeCordova? What goes on after the show, before the show? And it was really amazing to me that even when I was a teenager when Johnny went off the air, that there was still so much little information about those questions. And it was Peter Jones's documentary that he did for American Masters about Johnny Carson, where it was 2 hours, and I loved it. I sat down with Peter Jones in his office in Los Angeles, and I said, Peter, I just really wanted this thing to keep going. I have so many more questions, and I told him the idea for the podcast. He said, Mark, you need to do this. Tell everyone I endorse you. And it was just out of my sheer curiosity. I mean, I didn't really expect people to listen to this. Certainly not people at all the late night shows and well-known people listen to the podcast. I was just doing this out of my pure curiosity, especially what went on in New York, what went on in Burbank. And me sitting down with these people is just, I still, after doing the show for 4 years, is just a myriad of questions.
It's amazing, all those years that very little leaked out about Carson. There was usually the only time you learned anything about his private life was when he divorced one of his wives.
It would be that, or occasionally, because I've done so much research, he would let something out on air about growing up. But yeah, his friends. I mean, Johnny demanded loyalty, and you would never have his good friends. And he did. I know that the stereotype from the media was that he was a recluse, but he would go out to dinner. I mean, I can rattle off guests that Johnny would go out to dinner with, and people that he would socialize with. And he was in 2 poker games. He would play tennis with friends. He was definitely go to the Magic Castle. I mean, he was out and about, but he was definitely very, very private.
Are you surprised the people are now that, I mean, he's been gone for 26 years. It's hard to imagine. Not 26 years. He's been off the air for 26 years. He died in, what year did he pass? I
believe it was January of 2005.
I'll believe anything that you tell me about Johnny Carson. So it's, but even after he died in 2005, let's say, there wasn't like a big, Henry Bushkin did a book, which was kind of brutal. I listened to the audio version of that, but there hasn't been a lot of tell-alls on him since then. And it's interesting listening to your show. And I've listened to a lot of your shows. I stopped hop skipping and jumping around this past year once I discovered it, and I've just gone back to 2014 and started working my way forward. But listening to people feel comfortable telling their stories, the depth of the stories. I'm thinking about what was I listening to yesterday? Maybe it was I think it was Rick Ludwin actually.
Oh, I love Rick. I just saw him in Los Angeles. He's a great guy.
Well, and he tells some great stories, and he's very comfortable. I don't remember though. Did he tell one of the stories about going to lunch? Oh yeah, it did. It was. And I'm sorry, now I'm rambling. But Johnny had his offices after he retired in in a building that Arnold Schwarzenegger owned, right?
That's in Santa Monica. Yeah, Santa Monica. Shotsky's was the restaurant. Yeah.
And he told the story about walking in with Johnny, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was sitting outside, and he passed him by. I guess it was outside or maybe inside. He passed him by, and Johnny made a joke about the rent, and he says the rent will be on time, and Schwarzenegger didn't miss a beat and said, "Yeah, you were late last month, Johnny." You know, and I mean, these are just stories. And I don't know. It's a very entertaining show. Have you reached a point of saturation, or does your curiosity just keep going on and on?
I have so many more questions. I really do. I mean, it's funny because people ask me if I'm running out of guests, and I still have probably 200, maybe more people on my guest list. And it takes so much time to track people down. And a lot of times, people really do like the big names like Mel Brooks, Carol Burnett. But the most emails I get and on social media from listeners is definitely the staff behind the scenes, talent coordinators, people that really knew him a little bit more. I think those are the stories. And a lot of times these are people that have never talked publicly about working on the show. And the running theme with people that worked on the show is yes, Johnny was shy and quiet, but everybody I've talked to, they loved the man. I mean, they really did. And he was apparently the staff, they would say, I mean, many people told me just a generous guy. And certain people on the staff said once they got to kind of know him, and once he felt comfortable, he would be very loose and funny and almost the guy that you would see on the show.
And yet, like you're talking about the people kind of who you don't know, but was it the drummer for 30 years, the guy who was he the drummer in the band who you interviewed and said that he had been with the show and played with Doc for 30 years, and he only met Johnny once in 30 years?
I think that what might have been Bob Bain, but Bob Bain was the guitarist who just passed away.
Yeah, I don't think it was Bob Bain.
It was Don Ashworth then, probably.
It must be Don. Yeah,
Don. Definitely the band, because they really weren't there that much. They would see Johnny and listen. The band would normally have a holiday party, and Johnny didn't have to show up, but he would show up. The band threw it for themselves, and Johnny would show up. He was uncomfortable at parties. He would definitely be usually by himself do magic tricks, but if he had people that he felt comfortable with that he knew very well, he would be more open. But there were definitely people that were at the show that had a little bit of very minimal contact. But then, if you talk to some of the writers in the last 6 years, Johnny would have the writers to his Malibu home every Monday, and they would all get together and go over stuff. And in New York, when Johnny lived by that UN Plaza, the writers would go over to Johnny's home, and he would have them over, and they would be out and about. And you talk to certain people like Perry Cross, who was Johnny's first producer. Him and Johnny would go out. I know that Johnny was social with Peter LaSalle more after the show, and certain Bobby Quinn, who was the director. So Johnny definitely, would definitely go out and about. But I mean, there was just so much pressure on him, and he was so famous. He certainly couldn't be, and he had to conserve his energy for the show to some extent. So he couldn't be outgoing and let everybody in.
You talk a lot to your guests about the dynamic with Johnny and Freddie DeCordova and Peter LaSalle, and it's interesting because I grew up watching Carson. I mean, I'm old enough that he was there. I go back. I would say that I started watching probably around 72 or 73 when I was in high school, and so I watched a lot of years. My wife and I went out to L.A. on our one trip to L.A. and did all the kind of touristy things. We got tickets to the Tonight Show. I can't remember if I know this seems crazy, but it's been so long. I can't remember if Johnny was there that night or not. I only remember that it was a South African rock band, Johnny Savuko. I don't know.
I should look it up. I'm usually good. People email me all the time, and I'm usually good with figuring that stuff out. Yeah.
And I can't remember that, but I do remember it seemed like there was a break just as a viewer where he'd say something on camera to Fred DeCordova off to the side, and then you never heard that again. It just stopped. And so listening to the show, it's been really interesting. I wondered if you would take a minute and explain what happened in terms of the dynamic between Johnny and Fred and then Peter, because it's an unusual dynamic that continued.
Oh, you mean during the show?
Well, during the run of the show where Johnny basically cut Fred off, but he stayed on the staff.
So Peter LaSalle came in, it was late 1969, early 70, and soon after Fred DeCordova. And Fred came in because Johnny his comedy hero was Jack Benny, and Fred had directed Benny, and Fred knew everybody in Hollywood. I mean, he was really good friends with the Hollywood royalty, and he's the one that really worked, and Peter as well, to get Johnny to Los Angeles. And Peter and Fred had an arrangement. Peter would do the heavy lifting and do the real work, and Fred would be charming. And that most of the staff that I've talked to when I've asked them that they knew both said that this was the thing. And they each had signs on their desk, Peter and Fred, that said, Fred handles this, Peter handles that. And I mean, they would have in Burbank, they would have lunch every day in the commissary together. They'd play cards or games. They were friends, but yeah, Peter was just all about the work, and Fred would go into all the dressing rooms and say hi to the Hollywood stars and TV stars. And Fred would go to all the parties, and that arrangement really, really did work. And Fred, everybody said, was the funniest, most charming guy. Definitely could have a mean streak that they said. And it got to be the point where Fred and the culture back then. I've talked to people that were in television that worked there. Certain people in TV would drink at work during the show occasionally, and Fred normally would have some alcohol during the show. And one night, it was a really, really hard show. Johnny's son Rick had passed away, and it was a tragic accident. And Johnny had taken off time, and it was his first show back, and he did a eulogy at the end of the show, and they showed photos that Rick was a photographer. And the thing with the Johnny show, it was live to tape. I mean, they almost never stopped tape. They basically almost never went back. So at one point, there's definitely some different versions, but Fred either did the wrap it up sign to Johnny during this eulogy, which was really hard for Johnny, or was on the phone with Bobby Quinn. Johnny, once he perceived somebody was not professional or loyal, the relationship was over. And Johnny perceived, and it sounds like from me talking to people like it happened, perceived Fred just not to be professional with throwing him off. And what happened is after the show, Johnny told Fred, "You will never be on the Tonight Show floor ever again." And he never was during the show. So Peter it was like the last year and a half or so was the person that was on the floor, and Fred would have to either be in his office. He would still give the illusion going up to the guests in the dressing rooms, talk to them and stuff. And Johnny never relented. I mean, I've never heard of Johnny when he closed a door on somebody that it was reopened. I mean, that's just who he was.
Joan Rivers, of course, is another famous example of that.
I wanted Joan Rivers on. I just talked to somebody that was close to Joan Rivers. I've invited multiple people on the show. I worked for Joan Rivers just for one day, and she was wonderful, so nice. But if you listen to Joan Rivers' narrative of what happened, and she would talk about it in so many interviews, and then you talk to the Carson camp, their narrative of what went down was completely different. Barry Diller was in her camp when she went over to Fox, and even Barry Diller's is completely different than Jones of what went down. I make no judgments. I really don't. I wasn't there. I just ask people what happened, and all I'm saying is if you talk to the Carson people, the camp that were around, their version is completely different than Joan Rivers.
I would encourage anyone who has any interest, who even knows, first of all, what we're talking about, but has an interest in Joan Rivers and Johnny Carson, to listen to your interview with Barry Diller. A, I was stunned that he agreed to be interviewed, and B, he was very forthright, I thought, in talking about that, and very different perspective than we've gotten in the press before.
I would agree. Yeah, it was. I reached out to him and he emailed back personally, and I went to his office in New York, and it was just me and Barry Diller, and I mean, he was in the card game with Johnny. I'd talk about, but I was definitely most interested in him bringing Joan Rivers to Fox, and because Joan Rivers always said she wasn't allowed to tell anybody about this, because she would have told Johnny otherwise. And Barry Diller said his recollection was no, she told Joan, you have an obligation to tell him. And that everybody I've talked to in the Carson camp said if she just would have sat down with Johnny, and she had dinner with him like a couple weeks before. She had signed like 2 months previously. She never mentioned it. She was still negotiating to keep guest hosting the show. I think during those 2 months, she was still guest hosting the show. And they were trying to find her the last 2 days. They were calling her home in California. They were calling Vegas where she was as well. And she wouldn't take the calls. Her staff's like, I don't know where. Like, no, she's in L.A. No, she's in Vegas. And Johnny heard from Brandon Tartikoff the day before the press conference. So she found out about him, not even from Joan Rivers. So I just think that if you talk to the Tonight Show staff, they said it just wasn't. And they said if she would have handled it differently, Johnny would have been okay with it.
Well, I mean, could you say that a predicate to that situation was his situation with Dick Cavett, who was on his writing staff, left him, went head-to-head with him, and they still remained friends, and then Cavett came back to the show.
They did. I don't know if Dick Cavett has a firm recollection of how he did it, but I can't imagine. Johnny was so competitive that I can't, and it was everything about how people did it, and I can't imagine that Dick Cavett didn't tell him ahead of time, and then they still remained friends. Don Schiff, who was Johnny's
that's
person,
what I meant, but I think that Cavett indicated that he did tell him. He was very upfront. And
I'm not sure, yeah.
Cavett took other writers with him eventually too, didn't he?
Listen, Marshall Brickman and David Lloyd
Right.
decided on their own to go over, and I was surprised that Johnny was still okay with Dick Cavett, but he was. But I'm sure that they did it the right way. That's how it was. But Don Schiff, who was Johnny Carson's cue card person for the whole run, New York and LA, at one point there were Johnny's competitors, and his competitors wanted Don Schiff's business because he was the main cue card guy in town, and disclosure was the most important thing for Johnny. And Don Schiff said, Joey Bishop's people want my company to do the cue cards. Are you okay? And Johnny's like, oh yeah, of course. But just the fact that you would go down and be like my competition, and then at some point there was some sort of Don Schiff did the same thing when Joan Rivers' company wanted Don Schiff, and Johnny thought that Don Schiff was saying that he wanted to go over and do cue cards for Joan Rivers, him personally. And Johnny was like, if you was really hurt and was very, and Don Schiff had to be like, no, I would never do that myself. It's my company. And Johnny's like, oh yeah, of course, because he understood it was his job and it was his livelihood, and it was just all about the communication and just getting somebody's blessing and just doing it the right way. I'm sure if Johnny had heard that he was working for Rivers and didn't tell him, that might have been a different story. But it was just that telling him, getting the blessing, and moving on. And that's what the Carson staff have told me. I mean, there's multiple Carson staff members that have told me that Joan Rivers attempted to take them over with her to Fox. So it's one thing about competing against the guy who made your career, and Joan has acknowledged that. It's another thing to try to take the staff members over, because the people that went over to Cavett were all people that wanted to go on their own. And I mean, they were just ready to leave. I mean, Marshall Brickman told me it was one of those things. He just wanted to leave. And I mean, he did it the right way. Even though he didn't give Johnny a lot of notice, but yeah.
Didn't Marshall Brickman also kind of indicate that he became the head writer like on his, am I remembering this right? Like his first day, it was not something he ever wanted.
It was very quickly. It was very quickly. No one wanted the gig. It was a lot more pressure. It was a lot more work. The monologue people could conceivably come in at like noon or 1 and be out of there at 4. And it was definitely a lot of pressure. I think it was Walter Kempley or David Lloyd, one of the two that had just left. I think it was Walter Kempley. People didn't want the gig, and Brickman was the head writer then for, I think, 2 years. And then it might have been Hank Bradford after that, but it was definitely, the head writer was a lot of work. But yeah, Brickman was definitely thrust into this thing. I mean, I think Brickman's original, I don't even know if he had an office to begin with. I think he might have been in the hallway, and it was very, very quickly thrust into this.
And Mark, who have been, for you personally, now, not necessarily for the show, but for you personally, who have been the biggest gets as guests?
I think it's always the people that rarely to never do interviews. And Mel Brooks for sure does very, very little. And the only reason he said yes is because Carl Reiner told him it was a good time. I was with Carl Reiner at his home in Beverly Hills, and then he recording with him. And then that night or early evening, Mel Brooks' assistant, who I was emailing to try to get, said, if you're still in town tomorrow, Mr. Brooks has time at 3 o'clock. And I couldn't believe it. So I definitely think him. Definitely, I'd put at the top of the list Peter Lassally, who I'd become friends with. I just saw him when I was in Los Angeles. It's been so nice to me. He was Johnny's producer. He was also the executive producer of Letterman, of Tom Snyder, of Craig Ferguson. He worked with Arthur Godfrey. Peter just doesn't do much, and I was able to get him a message, and he's been so nice and supportive to me. So, I mean, those are definitely two gets I can think of, but there's definitely certain people that I'm shocked that they said. He's like, you mentioned Kate Capshaw, who didn't even do her husband's documentary on HBO, and she doesn't do interviews. I mean, I was very surprised when she said yes, and I was thrilled. And when I ask some of these people that rarely do interviews, that's always because it's Johnny. That's why they say it's about John, because it was about Johnny.
Were you surprised at the top of the show when I said that if I could only recommend one episode, it would be Kate Capshaw, or did you kind of get why I would say that?
I get it, and probably. I mean, first of all, I love sitting down with her, probably just because she does very little, and she was very open about Carson and just her career. I loved sitting down with her. She was delightful before and after. I mean, some guests don't really want to talk much before or after. Some guests want to talk a lot after, and she was just great, just the nicest.
I think what won me over was, it wasn't just her talking about being on the show or getting to know Johnny, whatever it was. It was that she went backwards and explained how important watching, and other guests have talked about, growing up with Johnny, but just the way she talked about the importance of Johnny Carson in her family,
That's
her
right.
mother. It was just so charming coming from this woman who who she is. God, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. But you've never heard her. I've never heard her speak. I've never heard her make
Yeah,
conversation.
I've never heard her, and some people don't really do interviews for whatever reason, but she was a fantastic interview, and I always just hearing that fact that her parents both went to Carson's show, and it was such a staple of
Hmm.
growing up. And yeah, I would agree. There's definitely certain people that I've sat down with, and I'd have to go through the list because we've done, I think, up to 190 with telling their stories. I'm because I really feel like as much as it is about Carson, it's about the guests, about their journey and them growing up watching Carson and what the show meant to them.
The Carson podcast can sometimes be very, for lack of a better description, inside baseball. You talk to Barry Diller, who people don't know started the Fox network, was at ABC early on with Michael Eisner. You talk to Fred Silverman, who's probably the only guy who's been president of pretty much every network. You talk to and Rick Ludwin, who is the head of late night programming. Um, do you ever hear from people that it's too inside baseball that they're lost? I mean, for me, as a guy who's grown up around media, hence Mr. Media, who's been reading the behind the scenes stuff for, well, let's say a long time. I don't want to age myself here. I find it fascinating, but I'm wondering if some people are just kind of like, I don't know what's going on in this conversation.
I'm sure that there are some people. I believe it or not, I've never gotten an email about that, and it was always when I was concerned early on. Am I going to have to say who this person is and this person, and give like 2 minutes of a background of who this person was? And I never have. I mean, the people that listen, and we have a great listenership from people all over the country, people at TV shows. I just, when I sit down with these guests and stuff, I was definitely like, is this too inside? But I just followed my instinct, which is that the listeners are going to stick with this and be able to follow it, and they have. But there's definitely, like, Rick Ludman was vice president of entertainment over at NBC, and he was definitely somebody I wanted on the show. We got very inside, but I got so many emails. I feel like when they're more even inside is when I get the most emails.
Mm.
And Rick's episode, and I know people over at the NBC building from all the late night shows, they all listened. But people in the public that are out of entertainment aren't in entertainment as well. Somebody with his knowledge and expertise and background, I think people are universally fascinated by.
Yeah, listening to him talk about late night is like Mark Maron, who has the WTF podcast.
Sure.
We all know Mark, and has been on here. Talked about his big fish was to get Lauren Michaels to come on and talk. And I just saw the Jerry Seinfeld getting comedians getting coffee in cars. And comedians in cars getting coffee, and he did one with Lauren Michaels. My wife and I actually just watched it last night.
Nice.
It was the same type of thing, because when you get those guys to open up their span of late night television and their experience, Ludwin talking about working with Conan O'Brien and being there for the, because, and I should point out to people that if you haven't heard of the Carson podcast, it's not just talking about Carson. Once Mark gets the people there, he talks to them about their whole career. So a guy like Rick Ludwin was talking about the entire, decades that he worked in late night and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's really interesting. I wanted to ask you, though, I made a reference in the introduction to your level of preparation, and I'm very impressed by it, because you always seem to know what's going on, and I've listened to enough of these shows now. Can you talk a little bit about how you prepare for each interview, and how many hours or half hour, how many episodes of Carson will you watch on average to prepare for a single episode?
I really try to watch everybody's appearance. Like, if somebody's been on the show like 5 times, I'll try to watch as many appearances as I can locate. So, I mean, for certain people, for certain guests, I've probably watched over 10 appearances. I mean, I just try to watch as many appearances as I can, and then I just go online and just do as many searches as I can on them and Johnny Carson, their careers. Definitely go to IMDb. Definitely try to go through just their biographies. And if they've done any other podcasts, sometimes I will listen and get little interesting things here and there. But a lot of my guests have never done a podcast before. And yeah, I mean, sometimes it can take anywhere from I mean, there's definitely guests that I can't find any information, like J.J. McMahon, who was the president of Carson, the first of Carson Productions. He was the first president. I had very little to go on, and I just was lucky enough that he had great stories. And then there occasionally that will happen, and then but the other people I will just try to go in as tight as possible. The prep can go anywhere. If I can't find anything, to zero prep, which is rare. Someone like Barbara Meltzer, who was in the New York office in early Burbank for a little, I didn't have any, so I had to wing that. And when Regis Philbin gave me zero to little notice, I mean, I got an email from his assistant, "Can you be here in 2 hours?" I was like, "Oh my!" To his home. I pretty much winged that as well. But normally, anywhere from a few hours to sometimes it can definitely take up to 7+ hours, depending on the person and depending on their body of their work.
Now, a trade secret. Can you tell us where you find all these old Carson? Is it the television museum, the broadcast museum? Is it?
I've gone there before, sure. I've definitely gone there before. YouTube. Johnny's nephew has been very, very helpful and very supportive and nice to me, knowing that I'm just trying to put a product out there that I don't know, that I try to do something that's just authentic, that's family friendly, and he's been really nice to help me too with definitely with episodes.
And you're not formally connected to Carson Productions.
No, they've been very nice to me, but my whole thing is just trying to follow my curiosity. I love hearing people's stories, but I do want to point out that I have tried to get people on the podcast that did not have the best experiences. There aren't many that I can think of. I mean, I've tried to get Wayne Newton on. I tried to get Paul Rodriguez, who didn't have a good experience. I've tried to get Elaine Boozler, who doesn't have great things to say, who only went on the show once. And I tried to get on. I'm trying to think of Joan Rivers. I tried to get Melissa Rivers, and I don't even know what Melissa Rivers would say. And there's really maybe only one other person I can think of. I mean, Bushkin doesn't have good things to say, but I just don't think he's a good fit, and he might not even do it. I have no interest. But all my point is there's less than, it's about one hand of people that have anything bad, and I can't get any of them to talk. And I just want authenticity when people come and they talk to me. So I would love to sit down with a Wayne Newton and just get his perspective and ask him a bunch of questions. But for some reason, because I really did think when I started the podcast there would be more of that, but there's relatively little. I mean, he definitely, in the New York days especially, had trouble with alcohol. He definitely wished he was a better father and husband. But yeah.
I was going to say, my entree to your show was comedian Rich Scheidner, who
he's great, yeah.
I have a Mr. Media, besides podcast, we have a small publishing arm, so we published his book, and then after he was on the show, he says, "Oh, you got to check this out," and I listened. But Scheidner has a great story too, because he's one of a handful of comedians who kept getting bumped and bumped and bumped. So finally, they did a show with just comedians who had been bumped. I mean, it was great.
Yeah, he was wonderful. Flip Wilson was bumped 5 times. I think, there's definitely been people that were bumped a lot. It was tough. I mean, you got paid, but it was definitely the nerves, and you're telling you're nervous, and then you're telling your whole family you're going to be on that night, and there's no internet, and you're listed in TV Guide normally. And but yeah, the Scheidner episode was interesting. He was great.
All right, so just a little bit more, and we'll wrap it up. I do have one small bone to pick with you, Mark.
Let's talk.
Okay. Actually, I think the bone is to pick with one of your guests, Charles Grodin. When you interviewed him in 2014, you indicate that he had said he had never done a podcast interview before, and I have to step up and say he was on Mr. Media in 2009.
Oh, you beat me. That's great.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to point that out. There's a fun guy to talk to. So anyway,
was it Skype or was it in person or was it Skype?
It was Skype. Phone? Yeah, it was Skype.
Oh wow.
Well, was it Skype in 2009? I don't know. You got me.
I wouldn't know.
Probably was Skype. It could have been phone. Probably Skype.
Oh, that's great that you got him. He was one of those guys that I was so excited to sit down with, because when I was a kid, I loved him on the show, and just the fact that the viewers on both, there were viewers on Carson and Letterman that thought it was real, his whole act, and I just loved it. But that's great that you were able to get him. I didn't know that. I will tell people from now on if I remember that I was yes.
Okay. I was a little nervous about having him though, because I was concerned that he was going to be that guy who was going to bite my head off, and so when he turned out to be a very sweet, pleasant, funny man, I was quite relieved.
Yeah, he's quite gentle. I mean, I thought he was great the two times I got together with him in Connecticut. He was wonderful, and that whole act that he does, and I think he just does it with people that he likes, just to be playful, is really really funny. I think I ended the first episode being like saying, "Last question, after I was at last question, can we be friends?" And he says no, and I knew he was going to say that, but that's quintessential Charles Grodin on camera.
All right. Last question, Mark Malkoff. Um, if you could go back, or if you had the opportunity now to ask Johnny Carson any question at all, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. Oh gosh, that's amazing. That's a wonderful question. What would I ask him? Oh gosh. Oh gosh, it's hard to pinpoint one.
Look at me playing Stump the Podcast host.
I know
Go
I
ahead.
can't. I don't know if I can come up with one question. That's so hard to think about. I mean, I maybe maybe who? Oh gosh. I can't figure that out right now. That is such a good question that I'm having trouble coming up with one. All I'm thinking about right now is rapid fire. The way my brain works is rapid. Is like when I'm sitting down with a guest, I have note cards, and then stuff just comes to me, and I just follow ups and stuff. But one question is tough. I'm not really sure at this point. That's such a lame answer. I'm so sorry. That's
Mark,
that's too good of a question.
Mark, there was dinner for two at Chasen's on the line, and you
Oh
know.
man,
All right.
I always wanted to go to Chasen's. Too bad it closed before I
Yeah.
go into LA. I would hope if I came up with a question, it would be about the show and not. I mean, I know he definitely regretted that he put all his energy into the show and not his family. But maybe certain reason, like certain guests stopped doing the show, why he stopped certain guests that were prolific on the show, why because it was really interesting to me that recently Charlie Barrett, who was the publicist, told me in 1986 that and he would go out to dinner with him that Carl Sagan, who did the show like so many times, and him and Johnny would go out to dinner, that Carson wouldn't have him on anymore. And I looked at the videotape and it matched up. And I'm always very interested on why Johnny, if he perceived somebody was not being polite or for whatever reason they were not welcome back on the show. And it's a mystery to a lot of people. And I'm always very interested on why certain people were stopped being booked. Maybe that, but I'm sure that there's a way better question.
All right. We'll let you off the hook with that. But
Yes, all right.
And tune in next time for another episode of Stump the Podcast Host. Folks, you can hear my guest, Mark Malkoff, every week or so on his fascinating show, The Carson Podcast, which is available on iTunes and probably everywhere else you can find a podcast. Mark, website, Twitter, Facebook, where can people find you online?
Let's see, carsonpodcast.com, markmalkoff.com. I'm on Twitter at mmalkoff, MMALKOFF, and I'm Mark Malkoff on Instagram. I think that's it.
Okay, all right. Well, Mark, I've really enjoyed getting to know you through your show and being able to talk to you today. And thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Media, today.
Oh, this was fun. I'm so grateful that you listen. I mean, it's incredible the emails I get. I was just in California doing interviews, and a gentleman who I ran into, and just the people that have listened, that have supported me, and the people that just miss Johnny. I just it's been just such the 4 years. I just never expected this. So just your enthusiasm that you listen, I'm grateful.